If we could settle down a little bit now, we get this program started. The senator has a press conference scheduled in about 25-30 minutes, so we want to take advantage of the time. I'll just go ahead and... I'm not going to waste a lot of valuable time with a long biographical introduction of Tennessee Senator Albert Gore, Jr. If you don't know his background, you haven't been reading your own newspapers. But by way of introduction, I would just like to make one observation. Early in the campaign, when Senator Gore decided to ignore conventional wisdom and bypass the Iowa caucuses, many political journalists effectively wrote his campaign off. They wrote, merely set himself up to be crushed by the momentum that the Iowa caucuses would give Richard Gephardt. The fact that half of the candidates who started in Iowa and won in Iowa are now history, and that Senator Gore is still fighting it out in the primaries in New York State, adequately confirm his judgment. It also puts in the political book of strategy another page that we can all misunderstand 4 years from now. So if you would join me in welcoming Senator Gore.
Thank you very much, Bill. I'm delighted to be here, and I appreciate the fact that Bill Kovich has introduced me. We're longtime friends and veterans of the same newspaper tradition, fellow Tennesseans, and I'm very, very pleased to be on the same stage with him. I'd like to thank President Kay Fanning and Program Chair Dave Lawrence, who also welcomed me at the door this morning. And I'd like to congratulate another personal friend who was my mentor, your incoming President, John Siegenthaler, who taught me when I came back from Vietnam. 2 days after I came back, he offered me a job, and I went to work for the Nashville Tennessean and stayed there for 5 years, and I had a tremendous education covering City Hall and state government. Started out on writing obituaries and covering police beat, and it ended up writing editorials. And now as I go into these editorial conferences and sit at the table and see people file in and take notes carefully, I remember my days when I was on the other side of that table watching itinerant candidates come in and ply their wares and respond to questions. But in any event, it's a delight and pleasure to be here as a former newspaper man and as someone campaigning for the Democratic nomination for president. I look forward to your questions, but I do have some introductory remarks that I would like to begin with. It was 20 years ago that our country was racked by the momentous struggles of 1968. It was two bold young men who met their death that year, who left us the most enduring legacy of those troubled times. So much has changed since then, and so little. It was Martin Luther King who dreamed of the day when all God's children would be judged by the content of their character and not the color of their skin. And today we have a black man appealing to Americans of every color as he contends for the highest office in our land. It was Bobby Kennedy who spoke of the hopelessness of ghetto life, who deplored schools that don't teach, and who denounced great corporations, and I quote, that are so large a part of American life, but that play so small a role in the solution of its vital problems. And today we still endure in equal measure these very ills. Now the Democratic Party is selecting a candidate to put an end to a dismal Republican decade of greed and deceit. I believe any Democrat will do a better job than George Bush. Deals with the Ayatollah cozying up to Noriega, joining in President Reagan's veto of the 1988 Civil Rights Restoration Act. No Democrat would take that approach, no Democrat would be so wrong. What would you have done, I wonder, if you were sitting in the Oval Office and someone came in and said, Mr. President or Madam President, we have just received the news that one of our trusted allies, the leader of Panama, is a drug smuggler. Would you have said, cut him off completely, take him off the payroll, let's pressure him from office, prosecute him if we can? I dare say that would have been your reaction. Their reaction was different. They said, keep it quiet, let's don't rock the boat, let's pretend it's not a big deal, let's sweep it under the rug. I think that's an outrage of the first order. What would you have done if you had been in the Oval Office and someone came in and said, Mr. President, Madam President, we have a great idea. We want to send a birthday cake to the Ayatollah Khomeini, and we want to bake it in the shape of a key because that'll be symbolic, and we want you to inscribe this Bible, and when we give him these gifts, we hope it'll soften him up for our proposal to swap weapons for hostages. We know that he controls the group that has the hostages. We trace the lines of responsibility after they murdered our Marines in Beirut. You probably would have thrown him out of the Oval Office and said, that's the stupidest idea I've ever heard. But, of course, they approved that, and George Bush was sitting there listening to the briefing and participating in the judgment that was made. So I do believe very strongly that the American people are ready to elect a Democrat who will put an end to the Reagan-Bush blueprint, and not least because they've led us to borrow $500 million every 24 hours, compiling the largest debts in the history of human civilization. But this nominating contest is about more than a candidacy. It is also about the future of the Democratic Party and about whether the Democratic Party is ready to lead our country. Will Democrats speak for a new American majority, or will we become like the British Labour Party, which criticizes and complains but cannot govern? That is one of the issues in 1988, because Democrats have lost 4 of the last 5 national elections. 3 times by humiliating margins, 49 states to 1, 49 states to 1, 47 states to 3. From time to time, we may profit from egregious Republican misdeeds, but we will never regain a stable presidential majority until we stand up clearly and unmistakably for what our country wants and needs. Throughout this campaign, I have tried to steer our party toward its greatest traditions of standing up for working families and social justice here at home, and for a strong, intelligent American role in the world. That's precisely what I'll do as president. I want to put the White House back on the side of working men and women, on the side of families struggling just to make it from paycheck to paycheck. The first week I take office, I'll propose an economic bill of rights for working families. I have a housing plan that helps young families get out of cramped apartments or their parents' homes and buy their first piece of the American dream. I have a child care plan to help working families get quality care for their children while they work. A health care plan that guarantees every working American affordable health insurance and gives every poor child expanded coverage under Medicaid. An education plan that lets anyone who wants to go to college borrow what it takes on terms that are affordable. And an economic plan, performance incentives, profit sharing, and employee ownership to help American workers get good jobs and better wages and more say in what they do. Working families also need more than economic opportunities. They need safe communities. I ran into a young mother in Brentwood, New York, on Long Island a few days ago, who was carrying her 4-year-old daughter on her shoulders. And she said, "I'm for you, Senator Gore, but I want something in return." And she motioned to her daughter and she said, "Please give her a school without drugs. Please give her something I cannot give my 15-year-old." It was a poignant, powerful plea, and one which we as a nation must respond to. I've called for an all-out war against drugs. If it means using the military as part of our interdiction strategy, then let's do it. We need tougher sentencing, less parole, more prisons if necessary. And I believe we need tougher law enforcement, particularly in the war against drugs. We also need a change in our priorities where foreign policy is concerned, and a comprehensive education and prevention program as the most important part of our war against drugs. I'll carry on the fight for civil rights and equal rights and human rights. I'm proud that I co-sponsored the Civil Rights Restoration Act. I was dismayed by Vice President Bush's sudden reversal of field and endorsement of President Reagan's veto. And where our nation's role in the world is concerned, as I mentioned earlier, I have spoken frequently during this campaign about the need for our nation to stand up for American principles and values, to stand in the tradition of Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman and John Kennedy. As a Vietnam veteran, I feel very strongly we must learn the correct lessons from Vietnam. But we must also understand that there has been a certain neo-isolationist impulse in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, which the Democratic Party has not yet placed in proper perspective. And we must think clearly and be willing to stand up for American principles and values. And in that connection, I have talked on several occasions during this campaign about the issue of experience in foreign policy. And I want this morning to revisit a controversy that began yesterday with an interview given by one of my opponents, Governor Dukakis. Is he coming here I'm sorry, I must have inadvertently hit a sore spot there. He gave an interview to the Daily News yesterday that was the subject of controversy all day long on the campaign trail. I have the transcript of the interview, and I want to say at the outset that some newspapers covered the controversy in this morning's editions on the basis of a transcript helpfully provided by the Dukakis campaign yesterday, which deleted the key exchange. It was a partial transcript, and I'm sure it was an inadvertent mistake on their part, but the first question and answer, which served as the basis for the New York Daily News's coverage yesterday, was in fact missing from the transcript that was provided by the Dukakis campaign yesterday. Let me read you the transcript, the official transcript, and one of my assistants took the time to listen to the tape recording of the interview to verify the transcript. Question: can you conceive of any scenario where you would use nuclear weapons first as a strategic weapon? Answer: yes, yes. And he continues, I would hope I wouldn't have to. And then they go into a discussion of the scenario itself. I believe that is a mistake. He talks about the possibility that the Soviet Union would invade Western Europe and the possibility that our conventional forces couldn't stop them, in which case the resort to nuclear weapons would come about. I understand that in this morning's discussions in the New York Daily News, the Dukakis campaign is saying that he did not hear the question clearly and did not hear the phrase strategic weapon. The Dukakis campaign goes on to say that NATO's policy is no early first use of nuclear weapons. Well, that compounds the original error. That is not NATO's policy. Let me read you what NATO's policy actually is. 25 years ago, NATO settled on what is still its fundamental doctrine. This doctrine is based upon two principles: forward defense and flexible response. Forward defense says, in so many words, that the alliance will not trade off West Germany for time or for room for maneuver, that we will aim to hold back a Warsaw Pact invasion right at the border. Flexible response says that NATO may respond to an invasion at any level of violence it chooses, whether by conventional means or nuclear. There is no qualification in NATO doctrine about whether we would use battlefield nuclear weapons first, or longer-range theater systems, or U.S. strategic systems. Any or all under NATO doctrine could be involved. Now, to say that NATO doctrine is no early first use is another error. Four distinguished former statesmen triggered a debate here in the United States when they proposed a doctrine of no first use of nuclear weapons. After that debate continued for a time, some of them retreated to a proposal of no early first use. Many felt that that was a sensible proposal, and that we should improve our conventional capabilities in Europe to the point where we could adopt formally a policy of no early first use. But we have not adopted that policy. NATO has not adopted that policy. And the leadership in the Federal Republic of Germany would be very interested in the assertion by the Dukakis campaign this morning that that is now official policy, because it is not. That policy at the current level of conventional force readiness would conflict with this fundamental NATO principle of forward defense and the principle of flexible response. Now, to return to the initial controversy, the question was where you would use nuclear weapons first as a strategic weapon, and the response was yes. What's the harm? What's the big deal? Why couldn't he just say that? Well, for this reason. If a president of the United States said formally that in response to a Russian invasion of West Germany, we would launch strategic nuclear weapons against the Soviet Union, that would invite Soviet planners to calculate the severity of their initial attack in a very different way. If they were told formally in advance that tanks crossing the German border would result in U.S. strategic missiles being launched at Russian targets, then they would be forced to calculate that if circumstances made it necessary in their minds to send tanks across the border, that it might be prudent for them to launch a preemptive strategic attack. Now, either these things matter or they don't. Either words have significance or they don't. Perhaps Governor Dukakis did not understand the difference between strategic and tactical. Perhaps he did not, in fact, hear the phrase strategic weapon. Perhaps he confused the phrase first strike with the phrase first use. They're very different, and the debates have been very different over the past several years. But the controversy is significant, A, because it's a serious mistake on a matter that is central to the role of the United States in the world and our relationship to our allies. And B, it is the latest in a series of statements which, taken together, make the point I've tried to underscore in this campaign, namely that experience in foreign policy, and particularly national security policy, is important to the choice of the next president. There was controversy over a statement about acquiescing in the establishment of a Soviet client state in Central America. Controversy over a statement about the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Korea in response to a lack of movement on human rights in South Korea. A statement completely misunderstanding the position of the Prime Minister of Israel on the negotiations in the Middle East, and several others in the same category. And so I think that it is a significant matter, and I think that experience is a significant issue. Some, of course, believe that primaries should not feature controversy or disagreement. I believe that primaries serve many purposes. One of them, particularly in the wake of this string of losses by the Democratic Party at the national level, one purpose of primaries is to give the party an opportunity to discuss the strengths and weaknesses of the candidates for the nomination, and to give those candidates an opportunity to strengthen and modify and evolve their presentations on the issues in hopes that the party and its nominee will go before the American people in the general election with the strongest and most persuasive message possible in hopes of increasing the chances of a victory in November. In closing, before your questions, let me say that these three goals of economic growth, social justice, and a strong and intelligent role for America in the world are the goals I believe the Democratic Party must emphasize in this election. I want to say to those publications here who have agreed with my approach in this matter and have so expressed themselves, I wish to express my thanks. For the rest of you, there's still time. And in closing, I'd like to ask for your support. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
You all understand the rule is that members of the society only may ask questions. Please identify yourself by name and the name of your newspaper.
Senator Gore, I'm Joe Stern from the Baltimore Sun. Could you tell us whether you think the doctrine of flexible response is still credible 20 years later, or if, as president, you would seek to change it in any way?
I think the doctrine of flexible response is still credible and cannot be changed so long as our conventional forces are at such a disadvantage compared to those of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. We may have an unprecedented opportunity to redress those imbalances, not only through more equitable burden sharing, but more importantly through conventional arms control. Gorbachev has made a series of proposals, several of them based on his articulated principle that the side which has more in a given category of weaponry should be willing to reduce. We should press that point and ask him why the Soviet Union needs a 2.5-to-1 advantage in tanks and armored divisions. The answer is they do not, and they should get rid of it. Conventional arms control offers a chance, therefore, to move away from flexible response in the future, but not now. We are not there yet. One other point. Bear in mind that this controversy over strategic weapons and battlefield weapons, flexible response and forward defense, takes place at a time when we are on the verge of ratifying a treaty that will remove intermediate range missiles which had served as a bridge between battlefield weapons and long-range missiles. It would take more time than we have to fully explore all the ramifications of this debate. Let me briefly say I strongly support the INF Treaty. I think it is a step forward. But in the aftermath of its ratification, which I hope occurs, we must be prepared for a vigorous exploration of exactly what flexible response means in practice with the removal of this intermediate category of missiles. Many of us have already begun to explore that. Many of you have written about it already. But it is a controversy that is extremely significant to the future of NATO, to the future of the strategic balance between the free world and the Soviet bloc.
Senator Gore, Bob Loft, Daily Item, Sunbury, Pennsylvania. You mentioned a number of government programs which you would put into effect the first day you were in office. These programs obviously would cost money. Do you have a formula for financing those programs and reducing the deficit? If so, what is it?
Yes, I do, and I've talked about changes in the three key areas. First of all, I've proposed a list of specific cuts in wasteful spending programs. And secondly, I have, and not just on the military side, but on the domestic side as well. Secondly, I've proposed some structural changes, including a partial means testing of some entitlement programs, and other candidates are unwilling to take that step. And third, I've listed a series of specific tax revenue measures to be turned to only as a last resort. I am not formally proposing any new taxes, but because they may become necessary, I've specified those I would turn to first in the event the preferable measures for reducing the deficit do not suffice. This is in large part a political challenge, of course, requiring leadership to rebuild a bipartisan consensus in favor of fiscal responsibility. We've been missing that for the last 7.5 years. And I believe the American people want us to turn first to the elimination of wasteful spending, and there's a great deal of it, and structural changes, which are in many cases overdue. But I think they also recognize that if our best efforts in those two areas do not suffice to put us on a steady, credible, believable path to lower deficits each year, then new taxes may eventually become necessary.
I think we'll only have time for one more. Brad?
Senator Brad Tilson, Dayton Daily News. Could you tell us what specific steps you would take to deal with the emerging class of homeless and people with inadequate housing in this country?
Yes, I'd be delighted to. About 3 years ago, I became deeply involved with the problem of homelessness, largely because one of my children was walking with my wife Tipper down a sidewalk in this city and passed a man in rags crawling along the edge of the sidewalk. And as is often the case, a child can see more clearly when looking at things adults have become numb to and don't really see anymore. We had a series of conversations as a family about this problem and became involved in it. Tipper organized a group called Families for the Homeless, which has just launched a nationwide photographic exhibit that'll be traveling the country. I became the principal sponsor of legislation to address the problem in the United States Senate. Briefly, I would move on several fronts. We must recognize the catastrophe that began taking place 20 years ago in our treatment of the mentally ill. We turned them out of institutions and failed to provide community mental health centers to make sure they kept taking their medicine and got the intermittent counseling and had the other needs met. Now they're on the sidewalks. 40% of the homeless, by most estimates, are in this category, and we must respond to it. Alcohol and drug abuse. We've got to challenge the policy that prevails in so many cities of taking alcoholics off of the streets at 1 o'clock in the morning, putting them into drunk tanks, and then the next morning turning them right back out again with no treatment or counseling or whatever. Many of them are resistant to treatment. I understand that, but we must find a more effective response. We have to do better with the victims of domestic violence. 15% of the problem is made up of battered women and their children. We must deal more effectively there. Runaways and what some, like Father Ritter in New York City, call throwaways. Veterans. 35 to 40% of the homeless are veterans. I met with the head of the Veterans Administration and found they have no programs at all to deal with the homeless. Where is their responsibility? And there are other categories. We have to deal specifically with each. But the one common denominator that affects all of the homeless is the need for more low-income and affordable housing. This administration